Okay, so the topic of my talk tonight is the Soviet nationality policies from 1923, 12-party Congress instituting the policy of Korenizatsiya or indigenization up until 1956, 20th Party Congress, Nikita Khrushchev in secret speech at the end of the regular conference denounces Stalin, including some of his nationality policies, most notably deportation of the Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, Balkars, and Kalmucks during the Second World War, although the much larger German population from the Volga and Black Sea regions are not mentioned, nor are the Crimean Tatars or the Meskhetian Turks. We'll get back to that a bit later. But the time frame is generally between the institution of the first systematic Soviet policies towards non-Russians, the so-called nationality policies, Nationality, uh, after the formation of the Soviet Union, December 1922, all the way up till the 20th Party Congress and the institution of systematic reforms to restore Leninist nationality policies, as the Soviet government would have said, socialist legality, but a much greater normalization of the Soviet state than what existed under Stalin between 1928 and his death on 5th of March 1953. So a little background here. Obviously, the territory we're talking about had been part of the Russian Empire before the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. The empire came to an end in February 1917 with the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty of Nicholas II, the last Tsar, and the establishment of provisional government for most of its existence under Alexander Kerensky, who will later come to the United States and be a professor at Stanford. So in the Tsarist era, Lenin, the first Soviet leader, declared that the Russian Empire was a prison of nations, that you had basically an empire centered around a Russian core, a contiguous empire like Austria-Hungary, unlike Britain or France, where you have overseas colonies, subjugating non-Russians. In the West, Finns, Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians. In the South, West, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and in the Central Asia, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmen, and over further east, even Tuvans, Buryats, Evenki, etc. Not to mention various diaspora groups, Jews, Germans, Greeks, etc. Even Koreans and Chinese. Now, this is a bit oversimplification. The Russian nationality, official nationality policy of the last Tsar was based upon an imperial idea of the nation rather than a blood and soil nation state idea as we come to think about it, particularly after World War I, particularly places in Central Europe, such as Germany or Hungary, or other states in between France and what becomes the Soviet Union in the end of 1922. Well, official nationalism in Tsarist Russia at the time of its end consisted of the idea that a Russian was somebody who spoke Russian, was a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, Pravoslav, and owed their political loyalty to the Tsar. So it is possible to assimilate into it, and while that wasn't all that common, there are a couple of notable exceptions, particularly large numbers of Baltic Germans from Estland, Livland, and Kurland in present-day Estonia and Latvia, converted from Lutheranism to Orthodox Church, learned Russian language, and became very prominent, particularly in the Russian officer corps, military. General Kaufman, who took Tashkent from the Kokon Khanate in 1865 with the Baltic German. You can tell by their names. General Piotr Wrangel took over the white opposition to the Bolsheviks from Denikin. Another Baltic German served in the Tsarist military, came from what is today Estonia. And as Tsar Nicholas II said, the nobility served the state, but the Germans served me. So uh, there was room for assimilation here. You also see with foreign nobility is there conquered by the Russians, particularly the Volga Tatars early on under Ivan IV, but also some of the Polish nobility after their conquest under Catherine II also assimilate in this way. All right, so it is not a nationality that is based solely upon bloodlines. Right? And at this time, rather interesting. It's perfectly possible for people of Jewish faith to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church and to cease becoming Jewish, to become, as it were, Russians. But under the Soviet era, Jewishness will become a nationalnost, a racialized ethnicity, as well as every other nationality in the USSR. So, but despite this fact that you could enter and become a Russian, as I said, it's largely limited to elite, particularly Baltic German nobility, and they were never very large population. For the most part, as Stalin said, one of the most infuriating things you could do to somebody was to deny them the use of their indigenous language. So Russification programs, which were largely aimed at Baltic Germans, Volga Germans, and other Swedes, Jewish minority in Finland, which came into Russian rule in 1815, to try and put the administration of all these territories into the Russian language, as well as education into the Russian language, and of course, military service instruction in the Russian language. So this also begins in the late Tsarist era. Religion, obviously, Polish Catholics, Lithuanian Catholics, Muslims in Central Asia and the Caucasus, not keen on converting to Russian Orthodoxy, prefer their own religious faiths, as, of course, mentioned, most of the Jewish population in the Pale settlement. And, of course, then there is the final note, loyalty to the Tsar. This is not as important because for most of the population, peasants, even majority of the Russian population, the Tsar was far away. But the policies regarding language and religion often much closer. So when the Russian Empire falls apart in 1917, particularly after the Bolsheviks take power in uh, November 1917, there are a number of attempts by non-Russian territories to break away and become completely independent. Uh, they were successful in Poland. They were successful in Finland. They were successful in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania up until 1940, when they are again occupied by the Soviet Union briefly, before becoming under German rule from 41 to 45, and then reoccupied by the Soviet Union. They are successful for 3 years in Ukraine under the Rada government, which Rada is Ukrainian for Soviet, which is Russian for Council, the Ukrainian People's Republic under Simon Petlura. Ukraine is basically independent state from 1918 to 1921 when it was conquered by the Red Army. Likewise, the three Transcaucasian states of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan are independent during this time. Georgia under the Georgian wing of the Mensheviks, breaking off from the Bolsheviks and the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Azerbaijan under the Musavat, and Beria, who will become the head of the political police, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, the NKVD, is a member of this government at this time. Armenia under the Dashnaks. There are also nationalist attempts to succeed, create independent states that are even less successful. Mili Furka, the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Alash Orda among the Kazakhs in what is properly Kazakhstan, although the Tsarist government called them Kyrgyz and called the Kyrgyz Kara Kyrgyz or Black Kyrgyz, in Kara being the Kyrgyz, but also general Turkic word for black. Oh, the Civil War is very complicated, and in addition to the break off of Poland and the Polish-Soviet War, recovery of Bessarabia, which is now Moldova, by Romania, break off of Finland, attempts to create independent states in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. There's also other conflicts at this time that have a nationalist overtone. One is the Japanese intervention with 75,000 soldiers in the Soviet Far East, which brings the vast majority of the ethnic Koreans in the Soviet Union, what becomes the Soviet Union in 1922, to support the Bolsheviks against the Japanese, whom they had fled from ruling their homeland, taken over the protectorate in 1905 after war with Russia, and then the Japanese made Korea into a colony in 1910, and lots of Koreans fled into Manchuria and Siberia, and they will come into Siberia all the way up until the early 1930s, and they're important for a very specific reason. In 1937, it marks a milestone of change in Soviet nationality policies. But the Koreans, very loyal to the Soviet government because largely of their hatred of the Japanese colonial rule in their homeland. So the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, and their core supporters, mostly Russian, because it is a workers' and peasant state, and most of the people who are not workers or peasants, for instance, nomads or mountaineers, are are not Russian. But you have support of some of these groups, split them off. particularly the mountaineers, against the Cossacks, as I mentioned, Koreans. But for the most part, the core of the Red forces, the Bolsheviks, like the core of the White forces under Denikin and Wrangel in the south, Kolchak in the east, Yudenich in the north, are ethnically Russian, and the various non-Russians had their own movements, most of them moving for secession. So they mentioned Ukraine managed to get independence for 3 years, as did Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Was less successful in Crimea among the Crimean Tatars and the Kazakh Alashorda. And of course, you did have a brief period between 1918 and 1940 of the independence for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The latter two having never had independent states, Lithuania having been a major empire of its own before merging with the Union of Poland. So, one of the things that the Bolsheviks saw was that they had just barely won the Civil War. They had fought not only against all these nationalist secessionists, unsuccessfully in the case of Poland and the Baltic states and Finland, but successfully against Ukraine and Georgia, and Kazakhstan, and other places, was that the national question was one that was a weakness for them, that they were going to have to make serious concessions to non-Russian nationalities if they wanted to maintain the territory of the former Russian Empire, minus Finland and Poland, um, and the Baltic states, and Bessarabia, of course. And this is because 1897, the first Tsarist census for the entire Russian Empire, the Russian population, as defined by Russian language and adherent to the Russian Orthodox Church, is a little less than half the total population. Now, after 1921, with the loss of Poland particularly, but also these other territories, it's a little more than 51%. But you still have 49% of the population are not Russians in the territory. And so roughly half of the population are not Russian, and they're very diverse. And so in 1923, at the 12th Party Congress, there was a huge supplement to the initial Soviet Constitution of December 1922, which joins Ukraine, Belarus, the Transcaucasus republics, and the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic into the USSR. That there would be a policy of each nationality would be given its own territory, its own ethno-state, and these already exist in the original Union, right, coming in, and more are created. In Central Asia, they carve out Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic and Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic. Tajikistan is part of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic at that time. Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan do not get full republics until 1936. So there's a Kazakh Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic and a Kyrgyz Autonomous Oblast. But this process starts already in 1918, October. The first actual autonomous national territory, the Volga German Workers' Commune, which is created by Lenin. And the second is the Bashkir Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, also in 1918. And 1919, I'm sorry. In 1919, the Bashkir Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic is created. But by the time we get to Korenizatsiya in 1923, we've got Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, and they will continue growing divisions within the territory up until 1936. Finalized Kazakh Soviet Social Republic upgrade from the Kazakh ASSR, and Kyrgyz Soviet Social Republic upgrade from the Kyrgyz ASSR. And from then, the only changes Karelia goes from being a Soviet republic to not being one, and the changes with the annexation of the Baltic republics, each taken in as a Soviet Social Republic, as well as Moldova, which is Bessarabia, part of Romania at that time. So uh, the policy of colonization take root is to create within each of these territories, whether they be Soviet Social Republics like Uzbekistan or autonomous Soviet Social Republics like the Volga German, who are upgraded to ASSR in 1924, or even an autonomous oblast, the Karachais have, or even the very small autonomous districts or rayon, such as the Koreans have outside of Vladivostok, or there are a number of German such rayons in Ukraine, one in Georgia, one in Azerbaijan, is that they will have institutions in their own language. They create official versions of their own culture and history, but these will all be Sovietized and placed within the context of friendship of the peoples, which will become friendship with Russia as time goes on, particularly after 1936. 1936 is another a key turning point in Soviet nationality policies. But from 1923 to 1928 is the heyday of Korenizatsiya, and it goes along with the new economic policy, since the other problem that almost led to the Bolsheviks losing was the peasant question. Many peasant uprisings due to forced requisitions, particularly the Green Movement, especially the uprising in Tambov under Antonov. Uh, so they had to make concessions there as well, but obviously this is just a limited talk. So during the 20s, 23 to 28, these institutions were given borders. In 1923, 1924, they draw out all the borders in Central Asia. The territories being cut up from the Turkestan gubernaria and the steppe there. They had been conquered, had been the Kokon Hane in 1865, finally. Tashkent taken by General Kaufman. And the Khanate of Khiva and Emirate of Bukhara were made into protectorates by the Tsar's government, but they are divided up by the Soviets into the states of Turkmenistan, which received some territory from the Khanate of Khiva, and then Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Large portion of both those republics coming from the Emirate of Bukhara. And the capital of Uzbekistan becoming Tashkent, and the capital of Tajikistan, Dushanbe. All right. So education in their own languages, administration, including court systems in their own languages, media in their own languages, especially newspapers, but also radio and film and theater. Promotion, affirmative action of the national indigenous cadres into the higher ranks, if possible, of the Communist Party and administrative apparatus, as well as industrial jobs, although this was particularly the latter difficult due to lack of training and education, particularly in Central Asia and Azerbaijan and some of the North Caucasian autonomous territories. So what this is called, Terry Martin calls it affirmative action empire, basically to create national elites in all of these national territories, kind of a union of ethno-states that would not only owe their be loyal to Moscow, but owe their very existence to Moscow, but would be able to avoid national uprisings against the central government in Moscow by using the British theory of indirect rule, as Lord Lugard, colonial administrator of Nigeria, said. The most indirect form of rule is the best form of rule. So if you let the local chiefs do all the actual ruling on behalf of the British, that would be the most effective way. And that is, in fact, how the British operated in West Africa, not only in Nigeria, but also in the Gold Coast, which later becomes Ghana. And Soviets basically in the 1920s turn it up to 11. So you create all these national cadres, be national informed socialists in content, give them pseudo states that have all the trappings, borders, flags, symbols, languages, histories of nation states, but have no political or economic autonomy. And this basically starts to come to an end in the late 20s after Stalin consolidates his power and removes both the left opposition, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky particularly, and the right opposition, Bukharin, Tomsky, Ryutin, from power, and later be tried and executed during the Great Terror. It becomes a backlash, and particularly because there is no similar policies towards the Russian core itself. They do not make the Russian Federation a republic the way they do Ukraine or Uzbekistan. Instead, it's largely negative space after you cut out all of the autonomous Soviet Socialist republics and autonomous oblasts. That's what left is Russia. But they're missing some key national institutions, such as the Academy of Sciences. On the other hand, the Russian language is still the official language of the entirety of the Soviet Union, whereas the other languages are only official within their ethnic territories. So when you get where the Russians are said, your homeland, your motherland, Rodina, is the USSR as a whole, very much in the line of official nationality, kind of the Russian Empire, an imperial nationality rather than a nation state one. Whereas you have the creation basically of pseudo nation states for all the other nationalities in the Soviet Union. So you have this bifurcation. So their homeland of the Ukrainians is the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, homeland of the Chechens is the Chechen and English Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, the homeland of the Uzbeks is the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, homeland of the Kyrgyz Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, right? So they have a specific territory that they are given, and it's linked to specific history, which is also linked to union, both socialist ideology in Moscow, but historically with Russia as a big brother, particularly after 1936. Collectivization of agriculture, of course, ends the new economic period, but it also marks the beginning of the end of unlimited koronization. And why you have a number of things happening here, but basically, first Stalin consolidates his political power. Most of his support, and he has a lot of it, coming from the rank and file of the Communist Party. These are ethnic Russians, and they are quite frankly fed up in many ways with affirmative action for non-Russians. Right, so they were sent off into these republics and told the Soviet Union as a whole is their motherland, and yet everything is geared towards Ukrainian nationalism or Uzbek nationalism, and there is a feeling that the Russians themselves are being deprived of the equal rights, particularly the consistent attacks on great power chauvinism by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s uh, fuels a lot of this backlash. So we start to see enforced collectivization provide the agricultural basis for socialism and industrialization. We start now to see attacks against non-Russians, the bourgeois nationalists. And the first one I've seen that's really significant comes out mentioned in a archival document. In 1929, during collectivization in Ukraine, there is a specific document regarding the dekulakization, that is, the internal deportation to restricted areas of internal exile, so-called special settlements, Spetsposeleni, of ethnic Germans. And it begins in 1930 and 1931. During collectivization in Ukraine, Soviet cadres, many of them outside Ukraine, 25,000. There's ethnic Russians, ethnic Jews from Russian cities, attacking Germans and Poles as being a conflation between their nationality and their class position as kulaks. And so I said, we see already in 1929, they mentioned German kulaks, not just kulaks in Nikolaev. In 1930, 1931, there will be mentions of Poles, similarly to be deported from the border. And there is reports at this time of the use of ethnic and racial slurs against Germans and Poles during dekulakization, forced removal. So about 1.8 million people are internally exiled to special settlements in 1930, 1931. So this is not a huge percentage of the population, but a fairly large number. It's certainly over 1% of the population. But when you look at certain groups like ethnic Germans, over 5% of the population in some areas. So in the Volga German ASSR, something like 6% of the German population are dekulakized in 30 and 31. They are disproportionately affected. And this will continue as time goes on in the Soviet Union. In 1932, 1933, there is the Holodomor, Ukrainian famine. And at this time also we start to see the removal of Ukrainian nationalist communists from positions of power in Kiev by the Soviet government. You had within these ethnic territories a number of groups where the local communists were trying to push for not just symbolic cultural recognition, but real autonomy on national basis. Ukraine was one of these areas. Crimea under the Crimean Tatars, the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, which was set up with subsequent legislation after it was formed to be a Crimean Tatar ethnic territory, even though they were a minority because they were the indigenous population. So in 32, 33, you have the creation of an artificial famine in Ukraine. It is largely to crush the peasant basis of the Ukrainian nation, but of course also does heavily affect other rural nationalities, Germans and Poles. Does not affect nearly as much the Russian and Jewish populations in the urban areas with a better food supply. Also, the famine affects other areas that are not Russian as well. A lot of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. Crimea is part of the RSFSR at the time, not the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan is an interesting case that we'll go over. The famine starts actually earlier than in Ukraine. Percentage-wise, it's more devastating. The total number of people that die is less. So in Ukraine, something like 3.8 million people perish of hunger in 32 and 33, whereas in Kazakhstan, it's about a million people. But Kazakhstan only has 4 million people. So difference is, whereas in Ukraine, 12% of the population dies. In Kazakhstan, it's more than double that at 25%. And what happens is, of course, the forced settlement of the Kazakh nomads and semi-nomadic or transhumanic population. They have a winter pasture and a summer pasture. Are forcibly settled, and there's not enough pasture land to maintain the livestock, the herds. So they slaughter them, eat them all, then there's no more food, and then famine sets in, and of course, large numbers of Kazakhs die of hunger-related causes, and others flee across the borders into China or further south into Afghanistan and Iran. Some even cross all the way from Iran into Turkey, and there's still a small Kazakh population in Turkey as a result of this. This basically attempt to destroy nomadism, which, as can be seen in practice, meant destroying lots of nomads physically, since they could not survive as sedentary farmers given the ability of Kazakhstan soil and climate regarding maintaining pasture lands. At this point, we start to see the movement from enemy classes, the kulaks, to enemy peoples, because certain peoples are deemed to have these features in their entirety, and that these are kind of primordially associated with particular ethno-cultural groups, while they don't ever refer to biology or genetics, because they make it primordial, that is stretching back into past forever and stretching into the future forever. Functionally, it doesn't differ much conceptually from term race as used in places like South Africa or the United States regarding nationality. And this has become completely hardened in the late 30s. So, in 1934, not very large, but there is an anti-fascist campaign launched by the Soviet NKVD. It takes over from the OGPU. And it is specifically targeted at German-speaking Mennonites, particularly in Siberia, but it comes as a result of the famines. These were groups of people that did receive, in some cases, German assistance to survive the famines. But at this point, we now see the association of people descendant of German immigrants in the late 18th and early 19th century into the Russian Empire with the German government, based solely upon their common bloodlines or ethnic heritage. And this will explode in 37 and 38, where there is a part of the Great Terror, a series of national operations. So some 250,000 of the nearly 700,000 people executed during these 2 years are executed during the national operation. Some 350,000 out of 1.5 million arrests. The vast majority of these people being members of diaspora national groups that are accused of being spies for their ancestral homeland, although these ancestral homelands did not exist in the same way that the modern states do. So the largest one are the Poles. These are Polish people that remained in the parts of the Russian Empire, the parts of Poland that were annexed by the Russian Empire, as opposed to Prussia or Austria. About 800,000 were in the Soviet Union till after Poland gets independence. And altogether, perhaps as many as 100,000 Poles, so over 10% of their population, executed as being spies and agents of foreign intelligence, particularly Polish intelligence, in 37 and 38. So the largest operation is the Polish operation. The second largest, the German operation, so 46,000 Germans executed. In total, 78,000 or so arrested. So you have over 20,000 sent to labor camps as well. It's over 5% of their population. So not as drastic as what happened to the Polish population, but still significant. And there's also a Latvian operation, because Latvia is still an independent state at this time, but there's some 15,000 Latvians arrested and shot out of 150,000 living in the Soviet Union, so about 10% as well. A Greek operation, a Finnish operation, an Estonian operation, a Chinese operation. And then, interesting enough, I mentioned the Koreans, a very large Korean population at this time, nearly 200,000 in the Russian Far East, over on the borders of Korea and Manchuria. There is not a Korean operation to round up and arrest spies at this time. Instead, the entire Korean population east of Lake Baikal can be rounded up, over 172,000 people. The rest either flee into Manchuria or there are small groups west of Baikal in Moscow and other places that are not forcibly relocated. But the vast majority of the population in the fall of 1937 are forcibly relocated as administrative exiles in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So this is the first time the vast majority of a single nationalnost, racialized ethnicity, have been forcibly relocated in the USSR. And they are, as I said, placed under restrictions of administrative exile by the political police, the NKVD, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. A lot of them die prematurely since there's not adequate housing or food or clothing or medical care for them. And this is viewed as a great success by the Soviet government in removing a population that they believed to be problematic. Largely, they did not believe that, despite their loyalty to the Soviet government, that Koreans could be assimilated into the new Soviet system, particularly because the Japanese controlled the Korean homeland, and they were worried that there could be influence from Korea proper, particularly Korean nationalists wanting to use the Soviet Union as a platform against the Japanese. This policy will be used again and again and again during the Second World War to deal with a whole host of national groups. And the first one in the fall of 1941, starting on 15th of August from Crimea, and then the 3rd of September from the Volga region are the Germans, almost 800,000 forcibly deported within the Soviet Union east of the Urals into Siberia and northern Kazakhstan, mostly western Siberia, Altai Krai, Novosibirsk Oblast, and Omsk Oblast, but about 75,000 into eastern Siberia, into Krasnoyarsk Krai. And later, the Germans from central and western Ukraine, who were rescued from deportation by the German Wehrmacht, they will be forcibly repatriated in 45 and 46 and also sent to Kazakhstan and Siberia. They are placed under the same restrictions as the deported kulaks, a special settlement, which means they can't leave their settlement without permission of the NKVD. They are basically confined to a single village and mobilized for various forms of forced labor. In 42, there will be secondary deportations from southern Siberia to the Arctic Circle for work in the fishing industry, and mobilization of the German population, both those deported and those already living in the east, about 200,000 at the time, to work in forced labor columns in mostly the Urals, felling timber or engaging in industrial construction or constructing rail lines. Although there is one forestry camp where they are sent in Siberia, Krasnov in Krasnoyarsk. And this policy of ethnically cleansing historically troublesome minorities, in this case, a large diaspora group connected to a country that had invaded them on 22nd of June 1941. It will also deport the ethnic Finns from Ingaria to administrative exile like the Koreans. I don't know why the Finns and the Koreans are not special settlers. It's kind of a range argument debate, but it has doesn't particularly have too much make too much difference. In both cases, the material conditions are awful. The legal conditions are slightly less strict for the administrative exiles than the special settlers. So, as the Soviet Union then advances west after its victory at Stalingrad in 1943, there are a number of not only diaspora groups such as the Germans and Finns, but indigenous groups which historically had resisted Tsarist and Soviet rule, which are small enough that they can forcibly disperse them across eastern regions of the Soviet Union as special settlers. In all these cases, they accuse them of being Nazi collaborators, but in reality, there's no more evidence of them collaborating on a greater scale than other ethnic groups, including the Russians and Ukrainians, neither of whom are deported in their entirety. So the Karachais, all 70,000 deported in a single day, 2nd November 1943, into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan as special settlers. Kalmuks, 27th to 28th of December 1943, over 91,000 deported into Siberia. And some 15,000 from Omsk will be sent up to those fishing camps to join the Germans in the Arctic Circle. 23rd to 29th February 1944, the Chechens and the English, about 400,000 Chechens, 100,000 English, deported into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. 8th of March 1944, about 40,000 Balkars deported to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. 18th to 20th of May 1944, 180,000 Crimean Tatars. Most of them, 150,000 or so, sent to Uzbekistan. About 30,000 sent to the Urals as special settlers. And finally, the last deportation of entire nationalities, the Meskhetian or Aziska Turks, as well as some Kurds and Hemshins, who are Muslim Armenians, deported from the border with Georgia and Turkey, from Mesketia, Javaketia, and Ajaria. And they were kept under these restrictions as the second class citizens, separate set of laws for them based upon their nationality up until 1955-56, when they are removed after the death of Stalin during the early reign of Nikita Khrushchev, mostly. Um, and they lose a large number of their population, some 500,000 people total, or 20% perish. It's more or less equal to this percentage for most of the nationalities, but the Chechens lose considerably more, some 30% of their population. Uh, in 1948, there was a decree that makes the deportation of these nationalities permanent for all eternity, navechna, for their descendants, and makes attempting to flee from their assigned village punishable by 20 years of hard labor. And anybody assisting them in such flight can be imprisoned for up to 5 years. And so this goes way beyond the war, and it goes way beyond uh, even Stalin's death. The first large-scale releases are not until 1954, and these are minor children under 16, followed by releases of Communist Party members, Komsomol members, and their families, and certain other categories. People fought in the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II, against the Germans. But most of the adult population still remain special settlers. The first nationality released in its entirety are the Germans, deported in 41, and they are released on 13th of December 1955. But they are not allowed to return to the areas from which they were deported, nor are they allowed to seek compensation for the huge amount of property they lost in the forced resettlement. And later, we will have 25th and 26th of February 1956, Khrushchev denouncing Stalin, cult of personality. He does not mention the Ukrainian famine in 32-33, which he was involved in. He doesn't mention the Germans or Crimean Tatars, but he does mention the Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, Balkars, and Kalmucks. And in March, April, and July, we'll have releases. So the last groups, so it's we'll have in March the Balkars and Crimean Tatars and Meskhetian Turks released from special settlements. In April, the Kalmucks are released. In July, the Karachais, Chechens, and English are released in 56. So by 1956, August, you have all of the nationalities deported in their entirety released from the special settlement restrictions. And in 57 and 58, the national territories for the Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, Balkars, and Kalmucks are restored. Now, the Crimean Tatars, Meskhetian Turks, and Germans remain in exile. The special settlement regime itself was not completely limited in 1960. There is an attempt to forcibly collectivize agriculture in the Baltic states and western Ukraine, as well as crush guerrilla resistance in those areas in the late 1940s. Partial deportations from those regions of farmers. The big waves being Operation Vesna in Lithuania in 1948, and Operation Preboy in all three Baltic states in March 1949. Uh, but nonetheless, the condemnation of entire nationalities, all Germans, all Chechens, all Kalmuks, all Crimean Tatars, as second class citizens under restricted internal exile for all eternity. This policy has ended by the end of July 1956. This is, of course, a few years after the death of Stalin on 5th of March 1953, so it's not automatic, but we do see in the wake of his death, this is a major reform and the ending of national terror, the ending of a system of national repression and apartheid against the smaller nationalities. So, in the post-war, post-Stalin era, particularly from 1956 to into the Soviet Union in 1991, there is somewhat return to the old ideas of Korenizatsiya, of course, for the larger republics, for the Soviet socialist republics, places like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, the policies never ended. But we see it restored even now for the smaller nationalities, the restoration of territories for the North Caucasians and Kalmuks. We see even though they are forced into diaspora in Central Asia and Siberia, restoration of some uh, German, Korean, and Crimean Tatar language newspapers, radio programs, and classes of education to learn the language. This happens in the Soviet era. It's not on a very large scale, very ineffective in preventing a loss of their native language and acquisition of Russian as their first language, but we kind of symbolically have these tokens there. The restrictions on residency will not be completely repealed against the Crimean Tatars on paper until 67, but in reality they exist all the way up to the end of the Soviet Union. They are repealed on paper for the Meskhetian Turks in 1968, but again, in reality, exist even to today with regard to returning to Georgia. And they are repealed on paper, but again, in reality, did not were not allowed on an individual basis in large numbers to return. For the Germans in 1972, and the German one is interesting because it's right before the Soviet Union was to sponsor the UN International Convention on the Crime of Apartheid, along with Guinea and a state in West Africa. And of course, the crime of apartheid, as envisioned by this convention, applied not only to South Africa but also Rhodesia, Namibia, and the idea was probably to apply it to Israel as well. But the first thing the Soviets needed to do was get rid of the law that said that German people of ethnic German descent in the Soviet Union were still prohibited from living west of the Urals. So, interesting connection there. So this we have a return to more normalcy under Khrushchev. He continued on the larger scale, particularly the Soviet Socialist Republics, but also a larger autonomous Soviet Socialist Republics such as the Volga Tatars, as well as Buryats, a promotion of local cadres, local languages, local histories, local culture, and one of the things, the promotion of local cadres is as the center became more Slavic, although not just Russian, a number of Belarusians, Gromyko was Belarusian, a number of Ukrainians, Brezhnev was at least part Ukrainian, a number of people of Eastern Slavic descent. And interestingly enough, Andropov was partially of Jewish descent as well, so those that assimilated into the kind of Russian ethnos there. Still, this imperial idea that you can become Russian, just as it's not purely bloodline. Pushkin was 1/8 Ethiopian, but the center becomes definitely more Eastern Slavic. Uh, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and the periphery become more national in the local government and leaderships, including Ukraine, which becomes more Ukrainian and less Russian in its leadership, but certainly Central Asian states and the Transcaucasian states become more ruled by local nationalities as time goes on. And this is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union splits as it does along national lines when the central power is basically vacated under Gorbachev, and Yeltsin takes the Russian Federation kind of out of it. The agreement between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, the other republics, are informed that they've been expelled from the Soviet Union back in 1991. And I'll leave it at that.